Let's take another look at another essay by J.B. Priestley in this collection called Essays of Today and Yesterday, and collated and brought together by George Harrap and Co. and printed in 1926. So I'm going to read this essay, The Prophets. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, and I saw them in the public forum in Hyde Park. In the 90s, which were crowded with professional Cockney humorists who gave us glimpses of life and jested desperately in and out of season, it was, I fancy, the fashion to regard these public meetings in Hyde Park as a magnificent free banquet of absurdity. The whole staff of Punch might have seen any fine Sunday afternoon pulling out their notebooks in the shadow of the Marble Arch, and women would titter and grow moist-eyed, and men would roll about in their chairs and almost suffocate with laughter at the very mention of Hyde Park. In these days, now that we have exploded nearly everything, our gun cotton, our ideals, and even our standard jokes, it is probably a sign of extreme youth or sentimental old age to think of these public meetings in the park as a glorious feast of fun. For my part, I have little interest in them, but they are usually conducted now by experienced tub-thumpers, old hands, and there is nobody more tedious after a first acquaintance than your old hand with his bag of cheap oratorical tricks, his face and voice of brass, his patched, sordid dialect. On the occasion when I saw this little group of 4 that I shall call the Prophets, I walked around the assembled crowds without stopping to listen to any of the speakers. There seemed to be the usual meetings in progress, some orators roaring out their approval of God, others noisily assigning limits to his prestige and power, and others again loudly denying his existence. The philosophers, the saints, and the angels were all being butchered by someone to make an artisan's holiday, and any idler present had the choice of some 5 or 6 entirely different universes. I was just turning away when I caught sight of the 3 men and the woman, the prophets, standing in a little empty space between 2 great knots of people. One was speaking, and the other 3 were supporting him, and apparently they had no audience at all. Something about them, perhaps their pathetic isolation, rather attracted me, and I moved forward. But as I knew that if I planted myself boldly in front of them, all their eloquence would be directly addressed to me, I merely walked forward to the outskirts of the adjoining crowd and drew as near to my 4 as I could without appearing to listen to them. This was sheer cowardice on my part, and I suffered for it, as one always does, for I could not hear a word they said. On one side there was a noisy political meeting and a great deal of heckling and shouting and booing, and on the other, where I was standing, everybody was singing a very objectionable hymn under the leadership of a perspiring Salvation Army official. I had to content myself with watching my little group, apparently ignored by everybody else, and at once absurd and pathetic in its isolation. All 3 men had beards. This was no mere coincidence, for there was something about these beards that suggested they were there on principle. They were all long beards that had obviously been allowed to go their own way, beards that had demanded and obtained self-determination. 2 of the men were elderly, and their beards were fairly full and satisfying, but the other, an undernourished fellow with bulging eyes, was much younger, and his beard, though longish, was thin, patchy, and straggling. A horrid sight. No doubt it was a rule in the tiny sect to which they obviously belonged that all male members should grow their beards. Many tiny religious sects have, I fancy, some such rule. There is nothing odd in this, because if a sect is only small enough, all its members become prophets, and prophecy demands that the chins in its service should not wag uncovered. Indeed, there is a type of beard, long and full, that begins and belongs to the prophet alone. This old and honourable connection between prophecy and beards is easily explained. Growing a long beard is the simplest way of going into the wilderness. The man who shaves is the man who has come to terms with this world. He who has foreseen the impending doomsday cannot be expected to lather his face briskly every morning, or come out of his apocalyptic vision in order to strop a razor. Nor can a prophet, no matter how minor, consort with barbers who care only for sport and sixpences and not at all for the wrath to come. Thus the tiny sects, made up almost entirely of prophets, are right to insist upon beards, and these three men, in letting themselves be overrun by their strange growths, were only doing their duty. When I first drew near, one of the elderly men was taking a turn on the little wooden soapbox and addressing a heedless word, but after some time he was relieved by the others. They were all much less vehement, as far as my eyes could judge of the matter, and more restrained in manner than the general run of park orators. They gave me the impression of men who know that it was not their duty to denounce, not to argue furiously, not to challenge and criticize, but to testify, without unnecessary violence, to the truth what was in them, a truth, I imagine, of which they almost had a monopoly. Every now and again, the little chorus of three, supporting the speaker, would nod their heads and make some exclamation to show their approval. The younger man, he of the vile beard and the undernourished look, was the most interesting. When he mounted the soapbox, there happened to be a moment's quietness on either side, where the hymn singing and heckling was still in progress, and I did actually catch the first two words of his discourse. In a thin, reedy voice, the very tones of one who is nourished chiefly on starry and insubstantial fare, who feeds on tea and bread and butter and visions, he cried, "We believe," and then the noise began again, and I did not catch another word. Nor do I know to this day what they believe. In all probability, the doctrines of their microscopic sect are based on some strange little heresy that has persisted in odd corners among bakers and saddlers in obscure towns for centuries. And it is more than likely that there is a great talk of the end of the world and the coming reign of the saints in the meetings of the sect. For all their quietness and mild glances, however, there was an apocalyptic gleam in their eyes, particularly in those of the younger man, and their beards had not sprouted on behalf of any shallow, time-serving sort of creed. Perhaps they knew the very date when the world was to be withered away and the stars were to drop from the sky like rotten fruit, and had travelled many a league with their soapbox to give us a warning. Perhaps they were ready and there to barter an eternity of bliss for half an hour of our attention, and because we did not choose to listen, already saw the angel of death making ready his sword above our heads. But no, if they believed that things were at such a desperate pass, surely they would not have been so calm. Surely they would have raised their voices and not allowed every roaring fool in the park to catch the attention of the doomed city. The woman did not speak, though, like the rest, she occasionally nodded her head in approbation. She was a sturdy, middle-aged woman who looked better fed and more sensible than her menfolk. Undoubtedly she had come with one of the men, and was probably his mother, wife, or sister. She had accepted the creed when she accepted the personal relation. And, being a motherly sort, she probably not only mothered the man, but mothered his poor little creed too. Against the background of these bearded fanatics, with all their starry folly, she looked robust and earthy, as solid as a hill. If her man had taken to drink instead of prophecy, she would have seen him through with that too, and would have gone with him into public houses to see that he did not take too much and get himself into trouble. As it was, she had come to Hyde Park to stand by the soapbox and nod her head with the rest. But doubtless all in a dream, her mind being busy with hurrying little images, with shifting faces, vague cries from the past, and the remembered grasp of little children. While outside the sun went down the sky, the crowd sang or cheered or heckled or drifted away, the voice just above her head droned on in the old way she knew so well, and she stood there, like a fool, perhaps, she thought, with aching feet, still nodding her head, though no one listened or stopped to look. As I watched this ineffectual quartet, in their motives like gods and in their wit like sheep, I pestered myself with vain questions. Where had they come from, and where would they go to? To what strange place would they carry themselves, their beards, and their soapbox? What did they do for a living? Did they go to workshops and factories and quietly enjoy the rough chafe of the others, comforted by the knowledge that they were men set apart, men guided miraculously by an inner light to the truth? Were they the only members of their sect, or were they merely the few who had volunteered for this particular duty? Where did they meet, and what did they do? Of what would they talk when they were on their way home from the park? Were they always conscious of their mission, their great destiny, or did they relapse on ordinary days into commonplace artisans or shopkeepers, strangely bearded? Were they moved to come to this place by an ecstasy of conviction that left them no choice but to express themselves in public, whether they made converts or not? And supposing, I said to myself, that these people, whom you think absurd, whose beliefs you actually know nothing about, are in the right after all, that by some miracle they have stumbled on the key to the universe and were busy on the soapbox tearing the problem of good and evil to shreds, that the date when these three men first met will be celebrated down the ages, that the younger one with the bulging eyes will ultimately turn human history in a new direction. What then? And I went on supposing and what-thenning to myself for some time. But nevertheless, while I was doing this, I was hurrying away from the three prophets and the woman, for I knew that time was getting on, and I was anxious not to be late for tea. Taken from I for One by J.B. Priestley.